So as you say, it might stop once they had, let's say, 1 or 2 films, but I suspect just 1 which did badly. Now, at the moment, they're still making money. And some of the films that are not well regarded, if you look back historically, actually were some of the biggest grossers of all. Moonraker, which most people don't think is a particularly good James Bond film, it's Roger Moore, actually was extraordinarily profitable. So partly it depends upon what the audience wants to do, but in many senses it's not so much the audience here now that's key. You know, America is the 3rd most populous country in the world, but if you can make money, big money, and then repatriate the money, which of course is the difficult thing, in India and China, you can also do well. So nobody knows. It may become that James Bond actually becomes progressively a figure in a different public culture or popular culture. Yes, sir?
Out of the entire body of work of James Bond, which one do you feel best encapsulates the character, or the idea that Fleming wanted to get across with the character?
Well, that's a good question. The film James Bond, the film actor that most approximates to the James Bond of the novels is Timothy Dalton. Timothy Dalton had a dark side, played it as a dark, capital R romantic hero. In other words, depressive. He breaks away from the Secret Service at one point. He's concerned about the terrible injuries inflicted on one of his friends. He's quite a, so he's not the kind of uncomplicated, violent adventure hero that Sean Connery brilliantly portrays. As far as the novels are concerned, I think From Russia with Love is a very, very good novel. Kennedy, of course, President Kennedy was very, very fond of James Bond, had Fleming to stay with him in the White House, and he particularly liked Goldfinger and From Russia with Love. Of the films, I think the best of the Sean Connery films is Diamonds Are Forever, partly because it's genuinely funny. And I think that is an element that usually, that is worth having in adventure stories. But obviously some people just want sort of one fight after another, which, it's not my scene personally. Sorry, Ben. Yes, sir.
Question and comment. Would you speak to the sidearm that he carried that changed over the course of the books? And as a comment, showing my age, in the 60s, while at Georgia Tech, I had a college professor tell the class that they could learn a lot about worldly sophistication by reading James Bond.
Well, I mean, he moves from a Beretta to a Walter PKK.
Comfort change, possibly.
Well, this is going to shock you. Unlike most Americans, unlike most Brits, we're not really experts on firearms. I mean, to give you an idea, this may shock you completely. Where I live, it would be illegal to have a firearm. As far as worldly sophistication is concerned, you're right. First of all, there are a series of changes that come when he goes onto the films. He gets a different gun. He gets a different car. I don't know if you know this, in the novels he drives a Bentley. Of course he moves to an Aston Martin and then to other sports cars. But he in a way becomes less of a 1950s character and more of a 1960s character. And he is part of the consumer culture of the 1960s. I mean, as you may know, Fleming wrote a series of short stories for Hefner's Playboy at a time that Playboy was regarded not so much as a pornographic magazine, but as a kind of sort of thing that men about town ought to read in the 90s. So, travel and how you should sort of clothes and this sort of thing. I suppose you could say that for the people in the 1960s who were men of a certain type, it represented an image of style and modernity. These days, culture has changed so much that some of the lines in the in the stories, the novels, and some of the lines in the films are cringe-making. That they are so out of keeping with what we think is appropriate. But then that's part of culture. I mean, to give you an idea, this is interesting, I think, from a historian's perspective. Take the following discussion at the beginning of the novel, From Russia with Love. James Bond is sitting there in a committee meeting in MI6, not happy. Well, we can understand that. Most people don't like sitting in committee meetings. They're having a discussion about what to do about Soviet penetration of British intelligence. Okay? So they're referring to what's really been going on in the news. They're thinking there of the Burgess and Maclean scandal. Okay? The committee is chaired by an ex-India Army colonel who is presented as a very conservative type. Bond says, well, you know, quite a few of these traitors are homosexuals, which is true. I mean, objectively, that was true. He says, surely the thing we must do is we must hire homosexuals to track them down. Now, we would think that was an absurd, unpleasant, and ludicrously sort of prejudiced viewpoint. The times of the 1950s, if you're thinking of your historical context, this is a fairly amazing remark. Homosexual acts between adults, or let alone against anybody else, or with anybody else, are completely against the law. You can go to prison for that in the 1950s. So what Fleming is actually doing is suggesting that people who are breaking the law should be hired for the secret services in order to be, and that their activities should be condemned. Now, how as a historian do you think about this? Do you think about this and say that's a very modern view for the 1950s, which it is? For the 1950s, that was an extraordinarily modern view. Or do you think about, because the attempt in the mid-50s to reverse the rules on that had been thrown out, and Parliament doesn't, in fact, abolish the legislation until the mid-60s? Or do you think of it from the modern perspective and say this is ludicrous and typecast and all the rest of it, and this is all part of a, you know, of a culture we don't like, we shouldn't read these books? So it's very, very difficult, and I mean, I think it is certainly the case. I mean, one of the times I got into trouble was a occasion in which I gave a lecture on James Bond in the United States in 2003. For the 50th anniversary, the University of Indiana's English department had a conference on the novels of Ian Fleming because Fleming's papers ended up in Bloomington, Indiana. They're in the Lilly Library there. And they asked me to do the closing plenary, and I thought, and they would then go to public, and I thought I'd give a talk that I'd never given before, because, you know, it's nice, you know, if they're going to publish them. So I thought I would speak on changing images of America in the Bond corpus. Okay? And I wrote what I thought was quite a good paper, and subsequently has been published and is generally regarded as quite good, and certainly nobody else has written on the subject. But anyway, I had an hour and a half for the paper, which is longer than you usually have. So I started off by saying in a nice voice, because, you know, this was the one at the end, I said, it'd be interesting to just, if I might, just make some comments on the papers we've heard so far. And I said, all of them were excellent. I have to tell you that wasn't true, but I wasn't going to get into it. I said, all of them were excellent, but I said, if I may, I'd like to make some suggestions for changes. And I said, for the history papers, I said, it's not really very good to talk about the Cold War in James Bond, because you need to be more chronologically specific. You need to make it clear what 1953 is and 1955 is and how the Cold War changes. And I said, for the cultural studies papers, I said, they're very interesting. I said, but unless you can show they're really important to the readership or to the plots, and it's only an issue in 2 of the plots, in only one case probably, I said I wasn't convinced of the value if we were going to have 12 chapters published of devoting 2 chapters of those to lesbian readings of James Bond. Whereupon the sky fell in on me. I was accused of all sorts of, you know, trying to close down debates and being homophobic and all the rest of it, none of which is true. But it reflected the way in which people take modern categories and try and use them, rather than thinking what would have made sense in terms of the values of the 50s and early 60s, which I, as a historian, am more interested in. Please ask other people, because what's always frustrating is if somebody comes up to me at the end and asks me something which would have been much more interesting if they'd asked me in front of everybody else, because hopefully the answer would have been interesting to more than one person. So please, if you're thinking of asking me a question on my own, ask me the question now. Yes, sir.
I heard, I don't know if you're familiar with the American TV show Get Smart, but it was about an American spy, and it was more of a comedy, and the intelligence community came up to the producer and asked how they got access to this, specifically the gadgets, how they came about this information. Did that ever happen with
Well, actually, it's interesting about the gadgets. One of the things Gorievsky said is that the KGB did devote a little bit of time to trying to work out whether some of the gadgets depicted work or not. I mean, some of them do work. For example, at the beginning of Thunderball, you have the rocket pack. You know the rocket pack that James Bond has on his back and that sends him over the wall? That actually works. I mean, you know. So some of the gadgets do work. Others of the gadgets don't work. So some of the cars that have been shown driving on their own, actually there was a little man down there in the footwell actually powering them. Yeah, I mean, people have tried to devote some attention to that. Most, again, bear in mind, with intelligence, most of the problem is not so much getting an intelligence feed, it's getting an accurate intelligence feed. In other words, it's getting the decision makers, it's finding out what the decision makers are really planning and meaning. That is not very easy to do necessarily. And particularly it's very difficult if two people are sitting and having a conversation to actually find out what those two people are saying to each other if they're face to face. So a lot of the gadgets to do with the James Bond films are to do with adventures, fleeing, moving fast, killing somebody with great lethality. Well, yeah, but so what? That's not what actually the basis of intelligence operations are. And in one sense, you could look at it another way around. James Bond is not really a spy. You know, in the stories he's a spy, but he's not really a spy. What James Bond really is an adventure hero. It just so happens to be that he is presented as working for a spy system. On the whole, countries like Britain and the United States use special forces for violent operations abroad rather than using spies. So, you know, it's a different kind of mechanism that one's talking about. External spies are usually deep cover operatives who don't spend their time trying to shoot people, because the whole point of them is that they have cover. You rather compromise your cover if you try and kill somebody. Yes, sir?
How do you think Ian Fleming feel about the way Bond turned out today?
I should imagine he'd be extraordinarily pleased that it made so much money for the film. I mean, Fleming himself became a depressive by the end, but he was always very interested in money. In fact, the interesting story about how how his papers ended up in the Lilly Library is really quite, it was quite interesting here. He, in the interwar years, was persuaded by somebody he met that it's to take, you know, he had no real interest, he was bored, apart from drinking and smoking. He was persuaded that it would be interesting to buy the first copy of every book or publication that introduced a major new idea. So he bought one of the only copies of the first edition of the Communist Manifesto, for example. Most of these books were science books, you know, science books from the 16th and 17th centuries. Very rare. And he bought them in part because also the market was extraordinarily depressed for antiquarian books because it was the Great Depression in the 30s. So there he is sitting on these enormous books. The Lilly Library, which had a big history of medicine side, wants to buy these books in the 1950s and 1960s. And he says, no, I'm not going to sell them to you. Doesn't need to sell them. Of course, he would have been delighted by what happens afterwards. After he dies in 1964, the estate sells them for a vast sum of money to Bloomington. And they throw in, which is rather ironic, they throw in his personal papers with them. So you can actually go to the library and see that one thing he did do is work very hard. He liked to pretend that he didn't have to work hard. A lot of authors are like that. They like to pretend that they don't work hard. And it was part of his self-image as a gentleman, that a gentleman doesn't really work. But the practicality is you can see the extent to which he redrafted and annotated extensively his manuscripts. So what happened is, Fleming, personal life, pretty unhappy, has a child, I don't know whether the child was really his or not, but has a child. The child, again, coming from a pretty unhappy household, ends up committing suicide. And in the end, the money descends to his nieces, and it's through them. A very, very, very wealthy estate. And I imagine that Ian Fleming would be quite pleased about that. Yes, sir?
What's your opinion of the parody version of Casino Royale that came out during early 60s.
Well, there's a Casino Royale parody with, of course, David Niven and Woody Allen. I think it's terrible. I mean, what I think is interesting, I mean, I'm not against parodies. I think good parodies are good, but I just don't think it's a mess. It's complicated. I think the, what's his name, the Canadian, Mike Myers, his parodies are not bad when they first came out. They get to push them too far. One last question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, actually, I'll just go ahead and go along with an inclusion of parody. Are you familiar with the current running parody, Archer?
So I can't answer on that one. Try another question. Yes, sir.
What would you say are some good spy parodies?
I think Johnny England's quite funny as a spy parody. I think it wasn't intended as a spy parody. It was intended as dead serious, but the Arnold Schwarzenegger one, you know, where he starts, I don't know if you remember this, he also has the scene where he takes off his thing and has his tuxedo underneath, just like James Bond. I think that's actually very funny, but it's not intended as a parody. Sometimes the ones that aren't intended as parodies are the very best. Well, look, I hope you found that interesting. I'm very pleased to have been invited again. Thank you for coming.